Good evening, everybody. Good evening, members. I hope you can all hear me well. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening, and welcome to the Wine Society's Burgundy 2022 online event. My name is Gil. I'm one of the events managers at the Wine Society, and I'm pleased to say that I'm joined by all-round expert of Burgundy, the En Primeur scene, and of course this particular offer and the vintage 2022, the Wine Society's Burgundy buyer, Toby Morrhall. Toby, good evening. There we are. Good evening.
Hello, good evening. Sorry.
There was that moment of dread there where the camera might not be working, but welcome. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Toby. And thank you again, members. As I say, just a little bit of housekeeping to start things off, as well as hosting tonight. I'm also running tech support, which I'm hoping will remain a role that is largely redundant and unused. But if you do happen to unfortunately encounter any tech issues, you can contact me one of three ways. You can either email me at tastings@thewinesociety.com, or you can on the Zoom app itself. You can go to reactions at the bottom of your tab, and there should be a raise hand function. If you press that, I'll see it and drop you a quick message. Or of course, you can drop me a message directly into the chat function as well. But as I say, hopefully that won't be something that is necessary this evening. Talking of the chat function, as always, at the Wine Society, we'd love to hear from you over the course of tonight's tasting, or tonight's event rather. We'd love to know where you're joining us from. If you do have any wine open, let us know what's in your glass, how it's tasting, how it's drinking. But also feel free, please, to share your stories, your insights, your feelings, your thoughts on all of the topics that we cover tonight. Lastly, before we get stuck into the event itself, we'd love to hear your questions. One thing that Toby and I have been discussing is making sure that we're talking about and answering questions that you want the answers to as our members, that you want to know about with regards to Burgundy, En Primeur in general, and of course, this particular vintage. So do fire away as many questions as you can. This is a great opportunity for it. I would encourage to use the Q&A function rather than the chat. That way, it just gives a greater opportunity for Toby and I to see the question, ask it, and of course, hopefully get an answer. Right, enough of that. Toby, I wonder if we might jump straight in, as it's quite a broad subject, quite a lot to cover, but I wonder if you wouldn't mind explaining a little bit about Burgundy En Primeur in general. So not specifically this particular vintage, but just the general overview of the En Primeur system.
Yeah, I'll try. I don't really have a very good grip on how it really evolved, but I mean, I think it probably first evolved in Bordeaux as a means really of financing stock. And I think in the old days, in fact, the négociants often had more money than the chateau, and the chateau would sell wine to the négociants before it was bottled. And in the case of Bordeaux Chateau, you know, the wines were in cask for maybe 2 years. And I think subsequently the négociants then started selling on to their customers. And in the case of Bordeaux, I mean, it's very difficult to make judgments on wine before the malolactic fermentation has finished. And in Bordeaux, you have high water table, certainly in the Médoc, and there aren't many cellars. There are chais, which are basically big sheds built overground. And the climate is relatively tempered by the Atlantic. So the malolactic tends to happen quite quickly. So it tends to happen in the spring. So in, say, April, May, after the vintage, that's when the professional buyers go and buy the wines. And in the case of Bordeaux, if you want the wine, you may have to put in payments there and then before the wine is bottled. Sometimes 3 or 4 times you pay to secure your stock. And the fact that it isn't being bottled for another 18 months means that, you know, you can offer the wine, you can get magnums, Jeroboams, bottles, you can get all these things organized before the bottling. In the case of Burgundy, the Burgundy opening offer tastings take place in November 12, 13 months after the vintage. So, for example, this year, when I went and tasted the 22s, it was in October, November 23. And that, as you can see, is a whole year, 13 months afterwards. And in fact, the wines are often bottled in the spring. So again, that's mainly, I think, because the malolactic in Burgundy historically took place in the spring or even the early summer, because in Burgundy you do have cellars. It's more continental. The wines are fermented and they go into cask, and the malolactic doesn't happen until the following spring. So historically, Burgundy is later. And basically, the Burgundians like to have had the next vintage in before they start pricing the 22. So the 22s, when I was there, for example, in October, November, the 23 had been harvested. And at that time, really, October, November, December, the Burgundians start pricing their wines and giving an allocation, and allow you to taste the wines. And I think particularly with Burgundy, the wines can be so expensive that obviously tasting before the advent of Coravin, tasting from barrel is a much less expensive way than tasting from an open bottle. And so Burgundy is, on the whole, you're getting your allocations in October. You're selling the wines. Most of the other our competitors do a January tasting. We do slightly later. And then really the wines are being bottled in March, April, and then shipped. So with us, it's sometimes we have to pay up front for the wines. So that is a way of helping the producer finance the stock. But often Burgundy is less of an absolute true opening offer in that sense, because often we're paying later. But obviously, the sooner you get to taste and ask for an allocation, the better chances you are of getting, your allocation.
Right. And is it then, I suppose you mentioned there about the difficulties and waiting until after malolactic. Are there any other areas in terms of tasting wines that early, even tasting 12, 13 months after, but tasting wines in that sort of early evolutionary chain, I suppose? Are there any other factors that can affect the way that wine's tasting? I seem to recall some comments I think you made recently or previously about weather patterns or certain days and certain weather or pressure that can affect the way that the wines taste. Is that right? Or have I misunderstood?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's a very approximate business when you're tasting. I mean, the best way to taste these wines would be to taste them, once they're bottled, they have a bottle sickness. So it would be nice to taste everything bottled 8 months after the vintage, all in the same room, all the same temperature. And then you could start to make comparisons. But so it does trouble me slightly that people weigh on every single word. Journalists normally give a range of marks, but just for example, when you go in October, I mean, sometimes the temperature of the cellars can be 17, 18 degrees, and then by the end of November, they can go down 3 or 4 degrees, and that can make a real difference for red wines. The other thing you alluded to is the weather. I mean, until a wine is bottled, it has sediment, and the sediment can be more or less present in a wine according to the pressure. When it's stormy and you have low pressure, the lees get stirred up. And in the case of white wines, where there's often quite a lot of lees, the wine can be cloudy. And when a wine is cloudy, it slightly suppresses the aromas and it fattens up the palate. When that wine is eventually racked to tank and then bottled, you get rid of the lees, and the aromas suddenly are much finer, more intense. The palate is fresher because it doesn't have the lees. And then simply you're moving between cellars of growers of different temperatures. The wines may be at very different stages in the élevage. I mean, people may have noticed that I haven't got any Domaine de Baleine wines this year, because when I went, the producer had just racked the wines. That is the process where you remove the wine from the individual barrel into tank. So you assemble all the wine together. But when you rack a wine, it can take 4, 6, 8 weeks to recover. And what happens is all the fruit disappears and all you taste is the structure. Yep. And so this is what happened on this occasion. And then I asked to have samples, and I tasted samples. I think at Stevenage, the supplier went one day and brought them back the next. Mm. And I tasted, I think, on the 20th of December, and they were still stripped. Yeah. So I didn't buy them because I just couldn't see. I mean, they may be wonderful, but so I mean, in other cases, you know, it's less. You make an allowance for that. You know, when I went to Barto, Clément the son has slightly changed the élevage. Instead of doing 18 months in barrel, he's doing 12 months. And so when I went, he just racked the wines. Well, I could taste the wines quite well there, so I didn't have to make it. And so it's very imprecise. So I just think people just have to allow a certain margin of error when you're dealing. Take the notes with a pinch of salt, because you know they're as accurate as you can be. But you know, it's a frequent observation. Growers will say, "Oh, the wine was tasting much better last week," or or it tasted much better this week. It was tasting, you know, on its tannins last time. And again, this is the effect of the sediment slightly muddying the aromas. So yeah, it is. It's an imprecise science, really. Mm-hmm. Although I think when all goes well, I think Burgundy is relatively easy to taste from barrel compared to, say, Bordeaux. I worked in Bordeaux for a couple of years and did a bit of tasting there. But Bordeaux, I think you are tasting wines which have quite a big tannic structure, and you're sort of calculating, will the tannins be soft by the time, and will the fruit still be there, or is it so structured that by the time the tannins are faded, there'll be no fruit left? Whereas in Burgundy, actually, sometimes the wines really sing from cask. They're beautiful aromatic complexity, sometimes almost better than when they're in bottle, because you hope they don't muck the bottling up. But sometimes you get these beautiful aromas. And in Burgundy, it's not particularly tannic. I mean, I would say Chambertin is tannic, and you have to make an allowance for that. I'd also say Le Montrachet is a bit like that. It's so structured that you feel a bit that you're just looking at the back of the whale or the top of the iceberg. So much is hidden below. But really, apart from those wines, you know, if it tastes good from barrel, it's pretty much going to taste good, in my view, you know, 10, 15 years down the line. So it's, in that sense, it's easy, but just the relative differences of each cellar being at a different stage, temperature variation, weather, you know, it all makes quite a difference. And also there's simply the act of sampling, you know, sampling is very different. I mean, I still think often the best way is when you go around a cellar and the guy puts a pipette into a barrel and he samples you. Some producers go in and they take while you're there, they take samples from 5 different barrels and put it in a sort of big glass and then sort of give you a blend of the 5 or whatever. Sometimes producers take samples of every single barrel the day before. And I had that once, which in a sense is great because it's very representative and you sit down and taste, you know, which is nice. But if they don't, one producer this year, they kept the samples in a room that was too warm, and it was Pinot and it oxidized. So the samples were shot, you know, which is why I'm a very sort of skeptical about some of the London tastings where the wines aren't actually sulfured or bottled, because Pinot particularly is very, very subject to oxidation, Chardonnay less so, but also I tasted. And the wines were lovely. So again, you know, how you sample, how you taste, there are lots of variables. I mean, I think, you know, you can get a pretty good idea, but I would just say, you know, when people are judging, should I buy this wine because it's £3 more per six, or the journalists given it 96 points, said 95. I mean, I think there's a certain margin of error which is just wise to be aware of.
Mm-hmm. I'm just going to, we've had a question come in here from a member, Andrew, who's, just as you were talking at the beginning there about the En Primeur and the fact that Burgundy has cellars within there, but he's asked, is there any difference in the wines from Pouilly de Montrachet because all their cellars are at ground level because of the high water table, and all other cellars are underground?
Yes, you're right about that. Yes, I think there is really. I mean, now, I think probably less now because people air condition their cellars. But certainly, there are some really lovely deep cellars in Meursault where historically the mallows were, you know, much later, and so I think the Poulignes, you know, in a slightly warmer environment would be more advanced. So yes, I think historically that was more important than now, where technology can compensate for the fact of not having an underground cellar. You can temperature control it.
Yeah. So I think you mentioned a few times there about your notes and how the wines are tasting in barrel, and if they're singing is a sort of phrase that I suppose I use, but if it's showing beautifully from barrel, and that brings me on to the vintage itself and your notes. I've just got your I'm turning the pages now of the offer in front of me, but because you allude a lot to that sort of tasting from barrel and how impressive a lot of the wines were, or some of the wines were. I wonder if you can give a bit of a summary of this particular vintage 22 that we're talking about this evening.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I thought this was an absolutely lovely vintage in both colours, you know, which is sometimes rare. I think it was very consistent hierarchically, that is from Bourgogne upwards to Grand Cru. I mean, often I try and tell people don't go necessarily for the cheapest wines. I often think the best value for money comes with Village and Premier Cru, because often the soil, where particularly the Pinot is planted, is at the bottom of the slope. It's more clay, it's more structured. So in fact, sometimes the Bourgognes can actually have quite a lot of structure and less fruit than a Village or a Premier Cru. So I often tell people don't buy the Bourgognes. But I think this year, I mean, it was a very warm year, one of the warmest ever. I think slightly less warm in the summer than 03, but I think it was warmer than 18, 19 or 20. But what's very interesting, I normally go on about the weather, but it's actually quite confusing this year, because in fact, although it was very warm, and you have to also just take a little bit of, be careful a little bit with statistics, because people talk about average temperature and they talk about certain sort of episodes where it was very hot. And in fact, what's very important too is the distribution of the heat. I mean, again, in 22, a lot of the really warmest months were January and February, which slightly advances the cycle, but it doesn't directly affect the maturity of the fruit. I mean, the other months, where it was ripening was, say, 20 or 30% riper than normal. I suppose what was slightly different this year was that there was quite a lot of rain in June, 100 millimeters in some cases, and I think there was much less water stress. So although 22 was, if you look at certain figures, warmer than 18, 19 or 20, in fact, for me, most of the wines are between 13 and 13.5 alcohol, which is normal. The aromas and the flavors are very much classic Burgundian. Burgundian register. And what you have is an absolutely beautiful also phenolic maturity. The maturity of the tannins in the reds is really so sweet. So really, it's a very sensual Burgundian vintage, normal alcohols. I suppose the difference is the tannins are slightly sweeter, and I think if you go back, the tannins would have been firmer, and I think sometimes when you have firmer tannins, it slightly depresses the aromas. So I think these wines, I mean, some of the most complex aromas I've tasted from Barrel, I mean, floral, but also very fruity in the same wine. And also you can have red fruit, black fruit, and blue fruit, and floral characters. I mean, I thought it was really quite amazing in some cases. So it's really a lovely vintage. Difficult to explain why it's sort of relatively classic given the temperature, but I do feel it is. And as I say, you know, it's very good hierarchically, as I've said. So if you want to go for Bourgognes, it's a very good year to do so. And also geographically, you know, the Chablis tastes like Chablis. I mean, probably again, if you go back 30 years, the Chablis would have been slightly more drier, more mineral. Now things are a little riper, but I still think they have a minerality. I think they certainly taste different from Côte d'Or wines. So again, and then you go to the south and the Maconnais, and you know the wines are richer. So you know you have really good typicity. The terroir is not, you know, the big thumbprint of the vintage doesn't sort of knock out all the terroir variations. And I particularly thought that 18, 19, 20, I did think some of the more delicate communes. So, for example, Chambolle and Volnay in reds and maybe Poulignes, I thought they were less perfumed and delicate than normal, whereas in 22, I actually thought the Chambolles and the Volnays had that lovely delicacy. They're very sort of, on the whole, they're quite early. Particularly Volnay is very early ripening. I mean, I think Frederick Weber at Bouchard said, Kyrie, in 3 days, the alcohol changed by 1.5 degrees of potential alcohol.
Right.
So, you know, he picked it very early, but he did it beautifully and he captured the freshness. And I think Pouligny for me too, which I think it does have a floral scent. I'm not sure if that comes from the cellars. I think one tends to characterize Pouligny as a little bit more floral, maybe Mercer a bit more buttery, but obviously it depends the grower and the vineyard. But I thought there was a really lovely floral character. I mean, I really liked Bouchard's Chevalier Montrachet and Henri Boyau's Claude Lemouchere. I mean, I thought they were lovely. And they showed, I thought, this beautiful floral character, this delicacy, which you know seems strange in such a warm year again, but just to repeat that, I mean, I really do believe it is there, and not quite sure how it happened, but you know,
I noticed. Sorry, I noticed in your notes that you mentioned the word freshness and pressure a number of times there. So that's kind of a hallmark of the vintage, both for white and for red wines. You use that term.
Absolutely. I mean, I think analytically, the 20s have more acidity. But the 22 seem fresher because I think in 20s you're on the boundaries of it becoming less Burgundian. I mean, most people are just about within those ranges. But I would say, you know, the reds and whites are much more floral in 22 than in 20s, you know, richer fruits, you know, black, rich, almost damsony fruit sometimes in the red. And I think the whites are a little bit sort of rounder and richer. And it's not often I get to compare, but when I was at Sauzet, they opened after tasting 22s. They opened the Combat 20, and when I was at Henri Boyer, Claude Lemouchard, again after tasting the 22, they opened a bottle of 20, and the 22s just seemed fresher and finer, a little bit more. Even though analytically the 20s have more acidity, but they have more ripeness, I think. So again, I think possibly the rainfall in June avoided heat stress or water stress, and you have this really apparent freshness and these floral aromas, which you don't get every year. You know, often when it's warmer, it's less floral, more fruity, and then often in the warmer years, it's more dark fruit, black fruit than red fruit. Whereas, you know, this year really had that wonderful freshness and elegance, I thought. And I, of 18, 19, 20, it's definitely for me, the freshest and the finest and the most Burgundian.
Right. Now, because we've got a few questions are coming in now, so I think at this point I might ask one or two of them, if that's all right.
Yep.
They're to do with this current release. So we've got one in here from Martin who's asking specifically about Aligoté, the varietal there, and asking what's the comparison with the Chardonnay grape, but also why it's not in the En Primeur and any good options of Aligoté.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about En Primeur is, you're not going to be able to get the wines for 2 or 3 years, because we don't deliver them until we're at 22. We're not going to deliver these until spring 23. And most Aligotés you don't need to keep. So, for example, I mean, we have got quite a few Aligotés. We've got 2 on the list at the moment. We get 4 Bataille single vineyard Aligotés, which will go in an offer this spring. And although you can keep Aligoté 15, 20 years, you can drink it, relatively early. So, I mean, that's the reason I don't put it in. I mean, I think Aligoté is very interesting because it actually copes with the heat very well. It gets most of its flavor when it is really golden colored, and it goes that color in warm years like 18, 19, 20, 22, and retains its acidity. So, it's lovely. So, I mean, that's the reason I don't put it in the opening offer, but we have got plenty. And, global warming has been very good to it. If you go back 20 years, it's quite late ripener. So it didn't used to ripen. So, you may have heard of Vin Blanc Cassis, which was white wine with cassis in it, Kier. And that was often made with an Aligoté because it ripened. The acidity was so hard that you wanted a bit of creme de cassis, black currant liqueur with some sugar in it to actually sweeten it. Now that's not the case at all. It was unpopular, so it hasn't been replanted. Therefore, most of the vines now are really old, which is an advantage because Aligoté can produce massive crops. I mean, sometimes they say the bunches have got wings on them, they've got or shoulders on them. They've got bunches on the bunches. And therefore it dilutes the flavor. I think with global warming, with serious people keeping the yields low, Aligoté's at an all-time high. We work a lot with Sylvain Bataille, who actually formed a group called Les Alligateurs, that is the producers of Aligoté. The symbol of them is an alligator, and it's been a roaring success, and I think it's a less is more wine. Often you can get, the problem with global warming is wines are almost too rich. And in a sense, it's, in the summer, it's nice to have a watermelon, which maybe doesn't taste as much, but it's very refreshing. And Aligoté is like that. It's like Muscadet or Picpoul de Pinet. It's got freshness and it's got verve and it's got, minerality. It's not particularly sweet and fruity. It's, it's a sort of less is more type. And when you're in the mood for it, it's lovely. And we've got quite a few. So, but we just don't put them on Premer because we think you can drink them before you you'll get delivered them because the delivery is delayed in En Primeur.
Yeah. You mentioned there about global warming, that sort of climate change, and I know that the last paragraph in your opening for this offer talks a bit about producers reacting to the warm conditions there, and it's a question we often get at events is the climate change and the impact it's having, and what are producers doing to sort of address those issues. And you did that wonderfully in that sort of closing paragraph. I know you mentioned things they're harvesting earlier, some only in the mornings, others have cool rooms, which I thought is that cool rooms as in heavily air-conditioned spaces. I suppose most producers, or not every producer, has the opportunity to create a cool room or a cold room, but these are some of the things that producers are doing to kind of combat that pressure.
Exactly. I mean, you know, a lot of people now are just picking in the mornings. I mean, they don't pick at night because, you know, you can do that with a machine harvesting, but you know, when you've got a torch on your head, you know, you're going to miss half of it. So, I mean, a lot of people, they pick really, you know, they start at 5 o'clock in the morning or something, or 4 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning, and finish by 12. And you know, if the grapes are cool enough, they will sort them and press them and ferment them. If not, those that have them will stick the grapes into a cool room. Or sometimes they have cool rooms. Sometimes it's a refrigerated container which they hire, and they leave it in there for maybe 24 hours, particularly with the whites. You know, so the temperature, you know, maybe when you're picking it, it's 16 degrees or something, and then by the next day it's maybe down to 8, and you know, you can press and ferment, and generally, you know, you preserve the freshness, and you know, the cooler it is, the less oxidation you're going to have.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, that's happening. People are reacting a lot in the vineyard the way they prune. I mean, they're trying to prune later. Partly because of the spring frosts, because the later you prune, the later you have bud bursts. And one of the big problems with global warming is, as I was saying, I mean, 22, you know, you had very warm January and February, and it's advancing the cycle. And so, but you still have danger of frosts, you know, until May. So now you have a lot of vines which are really quite advanced. And there's a very tricky period between budding and flowering where they're susceptible to frost. So the later you prune, the later it buds. But obviously, if you have a big domain, you can't do that for everything because you've got to get started. But what some people are doing now, they're doing like what they call a patai, a pre-pruning, where they go around and take off, you know, the excessive stems, and then do a fine pruning later. They're also leaving more leaves. You know, there was a time when, you know, you wanted to leaf pluck, and when it was cold, you wanted sunlight on the bunches, and now you want to protect them. So people are leaving more bunches, and also there's a quite interesting system called tressage, which means braiding, which means not cutting. You know, normally if you go around a vineyard in May, June, or one, they look like sort of hedges. They're trimmed by a machine. But when you do that, all the hormones are in the growing tip, and if you cut the tip, you often get side shoots growing, and this is not ideal. And it seems that if you don't cut the end of the growing tip and let it grow, it sort of, sometimes it goes up to 2 or 3 meters, and braiding is sometimes it's rolled, and it appears that if you don't cut the stems like this, the root, the growing point, you get better acidity in the smaller grapes, and because you're not pruning it, you get a little bit more shade. And that's a system that some very trendy guys like Arnaud Lachaud are using. And also, you know, we work with Sylvain Pataille and Jean-Marc Vincent, who are using a little bit, although it's very expensive to do. and you can only do it in your best vineyards unless you employ a lot of people.
Mhm.
So yeah, people are working on this. I mean, also I think, particularly in the reds, there's a lot more whole bunch, and whole bunch I think slightly lowers the alcohol because you have water, partly because you have water in the stems. And also, a whole bunch is very complicated. We could speak for hours on it, and you ask 5 people, you get different answers. But basically, it tends to reduce the extraction, because you've got whole bunches in there, and they're not crushed. Or you can crush them, but if you destem and crush, then you get more contact with the skins, whereas with whole bunch, some of the berries are sort of intact. I mean, they may be broken, and that also means the seeds are not, where the tannins are not leached into the wine, so you get less extraction. You change the dynamic of the fermentation. If it's hot, and you destem and crush, then the sugar's more readily available, so you get a much faster fermentation, which maybe you don't want these days if the grapes are already hot. So, a whole bunch slows down the whole rhythm of the fermentation. It slows extraction, and you seem to get very interesting floral aromas from it. And you get this, a bit like I was talking before, you get this impression of freshness, even though analytically in whole bunch, in fact, the acidity is lower because you have potassium in the stems, and the potassium combines with the acidity and it precipitates out. So often, with whole bunch, you get less alcohol because of the water in the stems. You get less acidity, but it tastes fresher. And so in years where it's really much warmer, it's an advantage. And when people started making wine, before they invented a crusher, destemmer, everything was whole bunch. And then I think people moved into a phase where they didn't want the stems, and so particularly in Bordeaux, places like that, and Rioja. Rioja, the first Riojas were made like Beaujolais, but then they weren't. And then in Burgundy, there's been much more tendency to have some whole bunch in Burgundy, but it's been vastly increased recently with the advent of the warmer vintages, because it does seem to give you freshness and less alcohol.
I've always associated whole bunch with sort of spicy characters in wines, but again, as you say, you ask 5 different people, you get 5 different responses as to what whole bunch does, or how it evolves in a wine.
Yeah,
for some reason,
some people immediately think, it's you get more structure from the stems. Well, if you crush the stems and treat them badly, then you get really nasty astringent tannins. But in fact, as I said, generally you have less extraction. So in fact, the wines are less tannic, more floral. There seems to be something in the stems that gives the floral aroma. Etienne de Monti says you get it, but it tends to come out 4 or 5 years later.
Right.
So yeah, and then there are also different ways of doing it, because some people do things like a millefeuille, sort of puff pastry layers, where they will have a layer of whole bunch, and then they will have a layer of they might just destem and have a whole load of berries, often intact. Now with a very good destemmer, you can actually remove the stems and have intact berries. So again, with an intact berry like Beaujolais, you get an intracellular fermentation before the alcoholic fermentation, and that seems to extract color and certain aromas. And that's again, it's a different start to the fermentation. And as you put more weight in, the berries slowly get crushed, and then the fermentation starts. But the intracellular fermentation, there's slightly delay and slightly slower and longer fermentation that you get with whole bunch, I think does make slightly finer, more floral wines.
Mhm.
Uh,
I think what we need to do, Toby, is maybe schedule some other online events where we talk in depth of the various winemaking options available, because this is fascinating. So we could talk about this for a long, long time, as you say. But I've noticed a question. Let me just bring this up. I think Joni sent a question through here that is very similar to some questions we've had from members ahead of time, talking about sort of roughly the house styles of the producers within the offer. And there's also a question as well, just bring this back up, that's sort of connected from James about the kind of differences between one producer's village wines and another's Premier Cru, and sort of the costing, and how some village wines can be more expensive than another's Premier Cru there. And general terms, is price the best or indicator for quality, or is it more of that kind of producer led? So I wonder, obviously, I think I did a quick head count. There's about 30 plus producers within the offer. So I'm not going to ask you to give the house style of them all, but possibly a cross section of a few of the producers within the offer and the house style that they present.
yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, you may have read my guide to Burgundy, which is on the web, but I mean, I sort of say producer before appellation, because although appellation is very strong, really the grower, the grower's influence really is very important in a sense that they have a certain style. I mean, for example, we were talking about whole bunch or not, and then simply things like yields. I mean, there'll be a massive difference. You know, in the same appellation, maybe there'll be a difference between 4 or 5 times in the quality of a wine, and that may often down to yields. And that's no different to Bordeaux. You know, I mean, you know, in Pauillac, you know, you can buy Chateau Bataille for whatever is 40, 50 quid a bottle, and then you have to pay 600 or 700 for Lafite or Latour. You know, Lafite and Latour are both Pauillacs, but Lafite is very elegant. Latour is more powerful. So these differences in the style of the grower are not just a Burgundian thing, but I think it's something that, in my experience, people do often ask you, you know, why is this person's Bourgogne more expensive than someone else's village? And I think the problem of this often comes down to the label. If you look at the label in Burgundy, even though the producer can have his name larger than the appellation, in Burgundy, virtually no one does. So basically, you have Bourgogne or you have Gevrey-Chambertin, large letters. At the bottom, you have the name of the grower. And in fact, I say the name of the grower is the most important thing. Now, this is very different from Bordeaux, where a wine is uniquely identified by the chateau. There's only one Chateau Beaucaillou, there's only one, you know, Bataille. Well, Bataille is from all of them. There's only one Coste d'Estournel. So, you know, when you're looking at those wines, you know, you're not saying, you're not buying a Pauillac first and then a Latour. You're buying Latour, and for me, that's really should be what people look at in Burgundy. You should look at the style of the grower. I mean, I think it, you know, as I said, if you take something like Gevrey-Chambertin, one of my favorite communes, it's a big commune, red. There are lots of different growers. Someone like Denis Morte, I mean, he died, but his son Arnaud is taking it from him. He's an amazing viticulturalist with much lower yields, and particularly with Pinot. This is very, very important. And you know, his Bourgogne is maybe more expensive than some people's Gevrey-Chambertin, and his Gevrey-Chambertin is more expensive than some people's Premier Crus, but it's the reason it's actually better.
Yeah.
So for me, the worst way to buy Burgundy is to sort of choose an appellation and then assume they're all the same and then buy the cheapest one, which is what I felt used to happen a bit when we used to list Burgundies by red and white and then ascending price. And I've now tried to group things by grower. And I try and give a little indication for the style. I don't always do it. And my advice to everyone really in buying Burgundy is try and get a handle on the style. And it is difficult, but in a sense, the same thing happens, in Bordeaux. You got the Pichon Lalande and Pichon Baron. Pichon Lalande's got a lot of Merlot, and usually it's got something like 45% Merlot, and it's a much softer and rounder wine than Pichon Baron. So, in Burgundy, you don't have different grape varieties. You have Pinot, but you have high or low yielding Pinots, the Massal selection against the clonal. You have the age of the vines, and Pinot Noir mutates amazingly. So again, one grower may have got an amazing selection of cuttings he's made from his own best, very low yielding vineyard and replicated them, and have really very superior plants to another. But I mean, if you sort of start with something like Gevrey, just in terms of the sort of the power of the wines, I would say, for example, Bourgognes, mes favorites, is one of the richest of all the growers in Gevrey. I mean, he's a late harvest. He's got very old vines. I mean, there's something like 60 to 90-year-old vines in that, and he is one of the last to pick. And it's strange still doing it, because when it was sort of when one was challenged by the weather, and you often didn't get it right before the autumn rains. Obviously, harvesting last, you were going to get riper wines. But today, often the wish is to harvest slightly earlier. But they seem still attached to harvesting very late. And actually, this year they benefited from some late rains, and actually their wines are lovely. But I would say, if you in terms of style, Bourgueil is very rich. I would say after that, Morte has a natural concentration because the yields are low. The sort of medium-bodied wines, I would say Môme and Marchand Tours are in that category. And then slightly lighter than those, I would say Rousseau, Bachelet, Topinot, Fourier. So, yeah, I mean, Moret Saint-Denis, for example, I think Dujac, a little bit richer than Topinot. In Chambol, Roumier is slightly richer style than Barto. In Vaune, Griveau, who used to harvest really quite early, is now more of a late harvest, and the wines used to be a little bit cerebral, but now I think are very rich and sumptuous. And I think they're richer than, say, Catiar, which I think his style is, particularly this year, I thought Catiar wines were very floral, aromatic, light color, but such perfume from them. In Nuits, I think Chauvenet is probably the richest one. I mean, we used to make very rustic agricultural tannins, but now global warming's been very good to it. And I think, it's really a commune to look at, because I think the wines are lovely. He made lovely wines, sumptuous wines. Lecheneau, I think, is just slightly more medium-bodied. And Chevillon is a very, very pretty wines. I mean, one tends to think of wines as quite structured and black, and the Chevillon wines really are very sort of perfumed and floral. Vaucrin, their top wine, is more structured, but they have very old vines, and the two brothers make it, and they're quite gruff lads. They're not given to flights of fancy, and yet you have these beautiful ethereal wines, which I think are beautiful. And I think of the Negociants, probably, again, I'm talking here of reds. Negociants, Jadot probably are the more structured. They traditionally have a very long vatting process, so the maceration is quite long. Bouchard, I would say, were in the middle, and I say Chanson. 3 or 4 years ago, they were unusual because they were the really only producer who used 100% whole bunch every year. So you got, even in tricky years. They've now changed winemaker, and they're varying it, but they still tend to have, a lot of whole bunch. And then you go down into Pommard. Probably Comte Armand is the richest. De Monty, I think, is very elegant, a lot of whole bunch. And Rebel Mur, which is one of our latest ones, acquisitions, is very elegant, very understated. I mean, almost his Pommards a bit like Volnay's. I mean, I said a little bit in my introduction that one tends to make these big generalizations about communes, and in many cases, there's quite a lot of truth. But like all generalizations, you get a little bit below the surface. And in fact, they can be quite different. So Pommard is known for making pretty rich, powerful wines, a bit like Nuits, because there tends to be quite a lot of clay in the soil. When you get more clay, you get more tannic wines. But in fact, in Pommard, there are quite a lot of, particularly at the top, and that's the same often with many communes. At the top of the slope, actually, you have more limestone, and clay, because it's the finest particle, gets washed down by erosion by water, and so the clay tends to collect at the bottom of the slope. So there is almost in every commune there's a dynamic between the more floral, fresher wines, at the top, like Chambol Crus is on limestone. Crus means limestone, and something like Bode has much more clay, and so it's much more structured. So although the whole village has a Chambol is considered very light and pretty, that there are more structured wines in the same way. Conversely, in Pommard, which is known for structured wines, in fact, there are quite a lot of vineyards which have more limestone and more sand. So, for example, Rebel Pommard comes from, it's like half and half vineyards at the top and half at the bottom. And the ones at the top are really quite high in limestone. So you get more mineral, fresher, less structured wines. And the bottom, you have a little bit more richness. But the house style of Rebel Mur, even in his own Pommards from clay soils, they're quite delicate. There's a sort of lightness of touch about it. They're not extracted. They're quite delicate wines. So there is quite a big difference between the growers, and it sounds complicated. I think it would be similar in other appellations. I think the problem about Burgundy is you have the complications of all the different vineyards and things as well. So it is complicated, but I mean, I think if you're interested, that's part of the fun, and you get intrigued. I mean, you may get turned off too much of it, but I think if you really want to get into it, then you have to start trying to taste these people and then work out which ones you like, because there's no right and wrong. In the whites, I mean, I think there's perhaps less house style variation. I mean, I think whites are very much. I think the date of picking is very, very important. If you pick too late, you're going to get very rich, heavy wines. However, with global warming, there has been this tendency to pick earlier and earlier and earlier because people are trying to preserve the acidity. But it's sort of getting to a point now that if you go very much earlier, you're going to get wines that aren't ripe. They're going to be green, So as well as people still harvesting pretty early, there are a couple of people. I mean, one of them was Frederick Weber at Bouchard, another one also Jean-Marc Vincent, Fontenay, where actually they're not going to pick really early. They want golden color and ripe fruit. But what they're doing is in the vinification, they're pressing the grapes much harder. So you get more structure to balance maybe the slightly less acidity that you get in picking later. So you get less acidity, but more flavor. And if you can compensate with a bit more structure from the vinification, then I think you're making very nice wines. So, I would say whites, there's less sort of house style. I mean, Rouleau which we don't do, is famously very mineral Meursault. Our Nuance is to, I mean, there are people who are atypical of their appellation. But I think generally the picking date is what really determines the richness or otherwise of the white wines.
Thank you. Yeah, no, just as you were mentioning there a number of the producers and the house styles, you mentioned two of the new producers to our offer, Rebauchon and Toponoma, I believe. And they might be sort of linked into a question we've got here about any up and coming new winemakers or new estates that you would highlight this year. Have any caught your eye? I mean, I presume with the two here, they've certainly caught your eye, and they're in the offer now. But are there any other up and coming winemakers or producers or communes that you're really seeing an upward trajectory?
It's very, very difficult to get in. Any domain that's famous in Burgundy is basically oversubscribed, and has got 15, 20 people trying to get in, and so it's very difficult to find good new domains. You tend to do so when the reputation of perhaps the commune changes. I mean, I think that's the case of Pommard. I think Pommard was unfashionable, but now I think with the global warming, it's very interesting. So I think that's what's happened. I've been looking for more Pommard because I think it's very interesting, and was lucky to come across Rebauchon, who are not very well known, but I think some of the journalists like Jasper and other give them very good marks. So they're lesser known. So I think that was an opportunity because I think Pommard was 60 years. 50 years ago, everyone wanted Pommard, and then it became unfashionable and tannic and sort of gruff, mean tannins. And now global warming has made actually those clay soils which give structure, they also retain water. So there's been a slight redrawing of the map, so there's slightly, Pommard's become more fashionable in the same way that, Marsanne, it's a bit like housing in London, 50 years ago, no one wanted to live south of the river, and 30 years ago, no one wanted to live in the East End in Hoxton, and now it's full of hipsters, and it's a trendy place to be. And the same way that as the best known appellations have more demand and get more and more expensive, then you start looking out to the lesser known appellations. So Marsanne, I think, was one of those which was a little bit off the map, but now is making lovely wines. Pattaya, I think, is lovely. I mean, also he's one of the few winemakers I know who makes all three colors well, white, rosé, and red. And I think Marange is another. I mean, we have a very good grower called Nicolas Perrault. His wines are not in the opening offer, but they're on the list. But Marange, again, it was very little known. It's south of Saint-Denis. It's quite high, so it was cold. It also has lots of springs, so there's a natural abundance of water, and it was cool. And in the old days, it made quite rustic wines because the maturity was delayed by the availability of water, which gave more growth and the altitude. And a lot of the wines were sold off to negociants as sort of vin médecin, sort of blending wines, which had this firm tannin, which would beef up something that was a bit lighter and in color and had less structure. So now I think global warming is smiling on them. So I think the other opportunity comes, on the whole, most Burgundian domains are still family-owned companies. And what happens is that, like all family firms, is the idea is to try and get the bright people of the family. The idea is to try and get the bright people of the family making the wines or not. So I mean, when a generation takes over, they can be much better than the parents or worse, and so suddenly maybe an underperforming domain is suddenly a new generation succeeds and reduces the yields and works harder in the vineyard, and suddenly someone who couldn't sell their wine, if you get in early enough on the sort of rising on the rising curve of quality, you have the opportunity to get in, and then by the time they've reached the top, it's difficult. So you have to try and have your ear to the ground yourself or with agents. I mean, we deal with some people who live in Burgundy and are very close to what's happening. So those are the opportunities there. And with Toby Morrhall, I've been tasting their wines for quite a long time, and I've noticed a real increase in quality. I mean, they are expensive, but I think they are superb. And we buy that through an agent, and I asked, and I got accepted to have a tasting, but a tasting is a little bit, you're being sort of interviewed by the grower. Yeah. They're looking to see, you know, if you know what you're talking about, if they like you. And there's still, I think in Burgundy, there is still, because it's family firms and relationships, that, you know, if they like you, they might say, okay, well, I don't like some of the other people, we'll give you their allocation or whatever. So it's a sort of mix of trying to spot changes in generations, changing in climates, where you know, the climate favors different appellations, and sometimes the personal touch.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, we've got a couple of questions that are related directly to the opening offer, which I'll come on to in a couple of moments. But just before that, another one in here from Richard asking, are Pinot Noir clones a factor, and are there many of them in Burgundy?
Yeah, clones are very important, as is simply there's a massive genetic diversity in Pinot Noir. And Aubert de Villaine is, you know, who's retired from DRC, but I think it's called Fondation Pinot Noir. I mean, he's trying to work with a lot of domains to preserve the genetic variability in the best vineyards, because, you know, you don't know what disease is going to come along. And climate change has been a really interesting subject. I mean, clones are interesting. It depends on the criteria in which they are chosen for. I mean, in the early clones, I think really, I mean, one of the things you try and do is try and get rid of the viruses which can leaf roll, things like that, where things don't ripen properly. And so healthier plants, you know, normally produce better fruit. But the early clones were often chosen for sort of like high production. Some of them were very good, but some of them were too productive. I mean, there's been new generations now of, you know, Pinot fin, Pinot très fin, where the yields are very much smaller. But now with global warming, almost you don't want tiny yields, because they're going to ripen more. So a decent yield is going to put a slight break on the maturity. But, you know, Pinot is unusual because, you know, if you go over 50 hectolitres a hectare, the quality drops off a cliff, which is not the same as obviously Chardonnay, but Syrah, Cabernet, you know, you can make lovely wines from 100 hectolitres a hectare. You know, that's why you get £7 Bordeaux and Côtes du Rhônes and things. And you don't get cheap Burgundy. So yeah, it's a massive subject, and obviously not just the varietal, but also the rootstock. You know, that there's been a big problem in Burgundy where there was 25 years ago, everyone was planting one called 16149, which was considered the best, but it's now not liking drier climates, and a lot of the vineyards are dying, and so they're being replaced by deeper rooting rootstocks. So yeah, the rootstock and the variety is very, very interesting. And I think in the 50s, you know, in the 50s there was a lot of what was called Pinot Droit, which means a straight growing Pinot. You know, there was before that there was one called Pinot Tordu, which means twisted Pinot, which was very difficult to prune, but actually had low yields, and it was replaced, you know, by Pinot Droit, and that had high yields. And that's obviously much less good. And I think in Santenay and Chassagne, you had, and probably also Marange, you had a type of Pinot that actually gave really quite tannic wines. Wasn't of very high quality, and I think it's quite interesting now. You know, Chassagne, you know, Mongeau is mainly a clay vineyard, which was planted to white wines because it was much more profitable. But you know, Chardonnay grown on really clay soils makes quite a fat, rich wine, and with global warming, that's getting worse. So there's a tiny movement to replant some of the Chassagne vineyards, which sometimes are on clay. And they're trying to improve the genetic. I mean, if you look at most of the old Chassagne vineyards, they're cordon pruned, you know, they're spur pruned, and that's a way of reducing yield because the genetic they had was very high yielding. So yeah, I mean, plant genetics is incredibly important, and as I said, it mutates, and it's very important for the quality and the style of Pinot.
Brilliant. Well, I'm looking at the time as well. We've still got plenty of time. There's no issue there. We've got a number of questions coming in. Remember, still, if you have one or two of your own burning questions to ask, do get them in now. But going back to the opening offer here, we've got one from an anonymous. But can you explain how you have decided on the drinking dates for the wines?
Yeah, it's a very personal thing. I mean, you probably ask 4 people and you get different drinking dates. I mean, with the reds, my feeling was generally that because the tannins are very sweet, you can drink them relatively early. But the inherent quality of the wines is so good that, you know, they will last a long time too. So one is often wrong when one says, "Oh, this vintage will never close up," and then, you know, Pinot famously, you know, is difficult to predict. You know, some people say don't drink it until it's 10 years old because what happens, you know, when a wine is first bottled, it's normally closed up for 6 or 8 months, and then I think there's a period where after that it shows slightly better, maybe for another 6 months or 12 months. And then it seems to go into its shell. And I think, you know, it's rearranging its tannins. I don't know, people still really don't know what's happening. And then, you know, it can be very closed for a while and then it opens. And so trying to predict when that's going to happen, you know, different vintages, you know, just react very differently. I mean, the 17s never really seem to have closed up. But I think probably things like the 20s, which are amazing rich, probably are starting to close up. So it's very tricky. So you give your best estimate. And with whites, I mean, whites, I am very strongly guided by the closure because, as you may know, there's been quite a lot of problems of premature oxidation of white Burgundy, which people argue about the causes. But for me, I mean, it's a conjunction of 2 things. The wines are a little bit less acid than they were, and acidity protects the wines, so they're more subject to mature more quickly. But I think one of the really big changes has been the corks. And I think, I don't know why, possibly because global warming is causing cork trees to grow more quickly. But I think the there's a very variable porosity to air in corks, even the best ones, which historically were only graded by eye. So quality is no guide to porosity. And Diam came along um, and basically it solved the problems of TCA because it gets rid of it. And it's able, the way it's made, to control the porosity. And there's like 2, 3, 5, 10, and a 30 there. They're sort of given those ages. Those are the times for which the company will guarantee the structural integrity, but many of them will last much longer. But anyway, it's been a game changer. So, and generally we try and always say Diam if it's Diam. So certainly Burgundies with Diam, I'm giving much longer drinking dates to. Wines that are in cork, I give shorter drinking dates to. I mean, you may know that. I mean, we lost something like £500,000, maybe more. And we were one of the few companies when there was this problem where our committee management asked me to taste the wines in the cellar, and wines that we found to be oxidized, we actually wrote to all our members and we replaced or reimbursed people, even though many of the growers who, I'm ashamed to say, many of them, many famous names, did not accept any responsibility for oxidation. They say, "Oh, you kept it too long," you know. There were some notable exceptions like Bouchard, who were amongst the people who were at the origin of Diam, and I learned a lot from their technical guys. I was a very early adopter of Diam. You know, Burgundians are typically very conservative, but you know, a lot of people changed. You know, Jadot in it, I think the 11 vintage, and then recently, you know, you've had Leflèvre and Lafont changing, which I think has also changed a lot of people's minds. But so yeah, it's a very personal thing. I mean, we give a range of dates because some people, well, some people consider mature, other people are considered too young. So it's a very personal thing when you like to drink them. So that's the reason for the range. But it is a personal thing. But I mean, I think, you know, I get some people on the community are quoting journalists who are saying, you know, you can keep the wine for 80 years. You know, I just think that even when you get a normal batch of corks is a variation. And so, you know, when we do tastings of 15, 20-year-old wines, particularly red wines, but white wines be the same, there's quite a difference after 20 years between a batch of corks, because a batch of corks comes from different trees. You know, a tree that grows next to water is going to grow faster and have less dense cork. It's why some people don't like the Atlantic Portuguese forests. They like Catalonia and Sardinia, you know, the Mediterranean climates where things grow more slowly and are denser. But, you know, just with a normal batch of corks, you know, you keep a wine 20 years and, you know, you know, we may open 15, 20, 15 bottles for a tasting, and you will see a wide variation in the age of the wine. You know, wines, the corks that are more porous will let more oxygen in, and the wine will be lighter color, it'll be more mature, it might be even over the top, whereas another wine with a denser cork will be darker in color, you know, deeper flavored, much younger. So for me, there is a real problem with natural cork. I mean, red wines are protected by their tannins, so it doesn't affect it so much. But you know, I would counsel, you know, not every wine improves if you just keep it longer, and do be aware that, you know, as I said, corks vary in porosity. You know, Diam doesn't. Most people are not using Diam for reds. I mean, Toby Morrhall, I think de Montillard, it's still quite rare. It's less of a worry. But certainly with white wines, I mean, as I said, I mean, if you've got Diam, you don't have cork problems to get rid of TCA, and the frost is controlled, so you can be much more confident in aging wines. But I think on the whole, the wines are also getting slightly riper, and I think the tannins in the reds are slightly sweeter, and I think the acids in the whites are slightly lower. So, I think you don't need to keep the, before you used to have to keep the wines for longer because they were closed and they weren't showing very well. Now I think you can probably drink them slightly earlier, and maybe they won't last quite as long. They're slightly different. But I mean, the best wines will last for 20, 25 years, but I wouldn't necessarily keep them 60 or 80.
Right. Thank you. I've just noticed the time here as well. So what I've done, there are a few questions that we've yet to answer. I've made a note of them, and members will try to get those questions answered for you when we send an email through next week, or early next week, or perhaps over the weekend. Try and get those outstanding questions answered. But noticing the time there, thank you very much. Firstly, Toby, of course, to yourself for your time this evening, for your insights and your expertise. It's been fantastic to talk to you about this and learn so much. Members, thank you to you as well. Thank you for your time. What I'll do is just leave a couple of moments here, Toby, for you to leave a sort of closing statement, I suppose, a summary again of the vintage one more time before we finish.
Yeah, well, I'll say to everyone, if you're in the market for Burgundy, really red or white, modest or great wines, you really can't go wrong with 22. I'd really encourage you. I think it's super. 23, I hate pronouncing earlier, but 23 looks like quite a big crop. I think there will be some very nice wines, but I think although 22 is slightly larger than 20, it's a normal size, and I think it is remarkable that from a relatively warm vintage you're getting these classic aromas, and I do think it's a sensual, beautiful vintage. So, if you need to buy some Burgundy, then, I would not hesitate with 22.
Brilliant. Well, there we have it, members. Thank you again to you, Toby. Thank you, members. And we hope to see you very soon at another of our events, both in person or indeed online. Thank you all very much and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.